Dear World Bank Family Network members and friends, welcome to today's session and workshop on third culture kids. Most of us have kids that are moving around the world and they have a variety of challenges. This is the first workshop within our World Bank Family Network youth program that starts from February, and it is really related to our kids. We will have, and we plan to have 4 workshops, so outside you can pick up the brochure that is related to the youth program and check the information on our website about the dates and details about the workshops. But today, we start with the parents. You're here, so we will have a wonderful presentation from MAHONEY. She is our speaker today. Ellen is also a third culture kid. She lived in Singapore and Japan. She has a lot of experience teaching and counseling in DC schools and New York City schools. After that, she became the director, one of the directors of iMentor, that is the leading organization related to mentoring of middle school kids and high school kids. From 2013, Ellen created her own company called Sea Change Mentoring, and she's here today as a presenter to tell us more about all these challenges of the young people. I would like to introduce her, and we have the pleasure of having her here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Everyone can hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm so happy to be here. I'm impressed that so many people were able to show up in this weather. And I'm really grateful for the World Bank Family Network to have invited me here. I met members of the World Bank Family Network a couple of years ago when I just got started, and I loved hearing about all the work that they were doing, and was always looking forward to maybe having an opportunity to come to this community and talk with you. So, yeah, that's a good idea. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's good, actually. Everyone can still hear me. Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about third culture kids, and those are young people that are growing up outside of their parents' home countries. I'm also a third culture kid, as we talked about earlier, and I'll tell you sort of my story in a little bit. But before I even start talking about all these details, I just wanted to sort of preface this conversation with you to say that sort of the theory that I subscribe to is called positive youth development. And that means that I believe that every child, no matter what their story is, has something positive within them that will help them through the challenging times and will help them, you know, find happiness and success in their own way. And that's really important, because I just want you to know that I have a positive perspective on children and human development. So before I jump in, can you just raise your hand and let me know if you have children under the age of 5? Okay, so there's a good amount of you, maybe 2/3, a third. What about under the age of 10? Okay, a lot of you, most of you. Under the age of 18? Okay, good. Okay, so that's great, because we're going to talk about sort of the entire span of childhood. My sort of specialty is adolescence, but in order to understand adolescence, you have to understand little kids too. So we'll be talking about that. Can you raise your hand if you have, with your family, if you have lived in more than 2 countries, 3 countries, 5 countries, 8 countries, 10 countries? Okay, what's the number for you back there? 7, okay. 8, okay. I've done this workshop before where someone had over 20 and her kids were only 16, so I was like, oh my gosh. So okay, that's pretty standard, believe it or not. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is what is a third culture kid? Beyond just the definition, what characterizes a third culture kid? What are some of their assets, like I talked about? and what are some of the challenges that they specifically face compared to other students or other young people. And then we're going to talk about what can you do as parents to make sure that they get through the rocky times well, and that they also learn how to reap all the benefits of having an international childhood, of which there are many. And then I'll tell you a little bit about Sea Change, and then I'll take your questions and answers at the end. But do feel free, if I'm not making any sense or you want to ask a quick question, you can raise your hand, no problem. Cool. So just to go into a little bit more detail about the definition of third culture kids. Third culture kids, the term was defined, I believe it was in the 40s, by Ruth Hill Useem. She's a sociologist. And then Ruth Van Raken and the sociologist David Pollock sort of brought that term to life and really popularized the word and tried to educate the international community about that word. They wrote a book called Third Culture Kids. I highly recommend it, and it sort of goes into the research and the theory behind this term. But like I said, these are young people that are spending a significant amount of their developmental time outside of their parents' original countries. It's during their developmental years, specifically more as we are forming who we are. So kind of between 5 and 18 is sort of like a good time span to understand third culture kids. They internalize multiple cultures. So for example, I grew up in Japan up until I was 12. And so there are certain parts of the Japanese culture that I still carry with me today that are very much part of my identity. I have a real strong respect for my elders, for example, or even little things that aren't really values. They're just sort of body language. Like sometimes I catch myself bowing to say thank you, or I'll touch my nose when I'm talking about me or what's for me, which makes my American friends laugh. But anyway, that's just how it is. But the interesting thing about internalizing multiple cultures into who we are is that often we feel like we have ownership of none. So even though my mother and father are from the Bronx and Brooklyn, and they consider themselves American, I really still I feel like at this point maybe I'm 80% American, but I still feel like a tourist sometimes in my own country. But then again, I also don't feel like I belong 100% to Japan or to Singapore. So, there's sort of that sort of dynamic going on. They might be highly mobile, so they might move around 5, 6, 7, 8 times while they're growing up. Or maybe they only move a couple times, but they're part of an international community where there's a lot of mobility around them. So for example, you could be going to an international school in the Czech Republic, and maybe you stay there for 15 years, but every 2 years, friends come and go, and every 2 years, staff come and go, and every 2 years, your parents' friends come and go. So there's mobility around you. And then you might grow up in marriages that are mixed nationality-wise, or otherwise, which is more and more of the case, which makes it really interesting. I love that, but it makes it really interesting when you've got maybe like a half Dutch, half American woman married to a Chinese man living in Holland, going to a British school, or the kids are going to a British school. So it's a lot in there. The other thing is when we talk about third culture kids, that's really the classic definition. But because the world is evolving the way it is and we are more and more interconnected, I also consider third culture kids young people that might be local to the community that they're living in, but part of an international community. So maybe this is their community, but their parents work for the World Bank, and maybe they go to a school that's very international. There's also some interesting things there that work for them as they develop their identity, for example. So that's that. Any questions about that definition? And okay, great. Can you all hear me okay? Good, okay, perfect. Okay, so that's sort of the story. My story is like I said, my parents are from New York City, and my parents are Irish American, and actually that sort of, it wouldn't be considered here an ethnicity, but that sort of cultural background is probably the one thing that's been pretty stable for me. So no matter where I lived, I always felt like an Irish person or a person of Irish descent. because that culture within our family was really strong. But that's, they're from New York. We moved to Japan when I was 6, and my parents had a really great perspective on living internationally. None of us had ever lived overseas before, and they just said, embrace all of it. Try and learn as much of the language, as much of the culture, understand the religions, explore, become independent, get to know all of your friends at the international school, ask questions, go to their homes, pay attention to the rituals and the traditions of each person that you come across. So, as a 7-year-old, that was just a great adventure, truly a great adventure, a magical time, and I loved it. That's me in the cheesy corduroys. But just a really wonderful experience. And then we came back to the United States when I was 13, just in time for middle school, 7th grade. Such an awkward time to move. And we moved to a community that was very similar. It was almost all the same race, almost all the same religion, almost all the same socioeconomic class. And most of the people there had not moved around a lot. This was in Connecticut. And people just thought I was a monster with 3 heads. It was completely confusing for them. And I found them completely confusing because every summer we would always come back to the United States. So I always thought, I never even imagined that I would have a hard time relating to other Americans, but it was challenging. Still a little too young to understand why. We moved to Singapore on my 16th birthday. And we stayed there, or I stayed there until I was 18, and then my parents continued to live overseas for I don't know how long, 10, 15 years, I can't remember. And same kind of attitude in Singapore. Eat the food, talk to the people, get a local job so you can, understand what it's like to be a Singaporean, and you can understand some of the cultures and the traditions. It was, again, pretty great. But then when I graduated, it was time to go to university, and I thought, all right, I've got to go back to the United States for college. I had such a hard time. And I chose a school in Ohio solely because Ohio sounded so American to me. And I had no idea, this is how naive I was. I thought cowboys, hot dogs, 4th of July, Americana. And all of those references just came from movies. I wasn't, the United States, by the way, was like New York City and Long Island. It was just none of those things. I just thought that, and my parents said I was crazy, but they thought, well, go ahead and try it out. And I went, and I had a really hard time. And I went through reverse culture shock, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, which is just being confused by your own, it's the same feeling of culture shock, but it's being confused by your own culture. Which is actually worse than culture shock. And that actually triggered a depression in me, which I actually never spoke about publicly until I started Sea Change mentoring because of the taboo. In my family culture, you don't talk about that kind of stuff, but I was depressed for many years, on and off. And when I was in college, I thought, this is crazy because I feel really sad about a time in my life that gave me so much joy. So, what's going on there? And I reached out to my friends around the world in all these different countries, and I said, how are you doing? This is back in the day of actual letter writing, so it took a long time. But they all responded to me saying that they were struggling. Some just saying, it's hard, but I'm managing. And some, it was much worse. There was some alcohol and drug abuse for people who were just using that to figure out how to cope. And then there was some very serious depression, and unfortunately, there was a couple of suicides and a suicide attempt of friends of mine. And at that point, I thought, this is crazy. This is a phenomenon. We're all experiencing the same emotions on the first layer. We're reacting to it differently, but we all are experiencing something similar. How is it that no one warned us of this? It has to be an international phenomenon. And in my head, I just thought, someday I will come back to the international community and I will help kids make this transition, because it's a beautiful life to live internationally, but you want to be able to make the most of it. So that was always in the back of my head. I ended up teaching and counseling, as you heard, in New York and DC for a while, until always in the back of my head thinking, I want to go back, I want to go back. When I went to grad school here at GW, there wasn't a lot of research yet on this phenomenon, not really good, not a solid amount of research. So I ended up not studying that after all. and I studied parenting instead. And then just while I was working at iMentor, that major earthquake happened in Tokyo and the tsunami after that. And I was really upset watching the news. And I said to my husband, I don't know why I'm crying. It's not like I'm Japanese. That's the Irish in me trying to keep it together. And he looked at me and he said, you've got to be kidding me. That's your home. And for me, it was just the light bulb moment that I really needed to get motivated to come back to the international community. So for me, I started talking to people back in Japan, and I started designing a mentoring program to give to the school that I went to, and then I thought, no. And I just sort of eventually quit my job and started my program. But that'll give you a sense that I've been there, and I've learned the hard way. No one needs to go through the way I did it. Thankfully, things have changed so much. So that's that. So I do want to talk about all the positives, and we'll talk about some of the challenges as well. But the skill sets of a third culture kid, actually, don't even look at this. Close your eyes. Okay, you all have children. You are the experts of your children. So what would you say are some of the skills that they are picking up internationally?
Open mind.
Having an open mind, definitely. Someone, yeah.
Language.
Yes.
Understanding of the situation from the point of view of the other.
Yes, that's huge. So language and understanding the point of view of the other. That is huge. So, and that will translate also to being able to solve problems considering multiple perspectives, which is a skill set this world needs greatly, and any business needs. So that's a really great skill. The language, I mean, it's amazing to be able to be even just bilingual, but so many third culture kids can speak multiple languages, and not just the verbal language, but understanding the body language, or if you don't speak each other's language, how to communicate anyway. I think those are all really important skills that third culture kids pick up. Yeah. What else? Yes. Adapt in any situation, no problem. Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you start young and you're going from culture to culture, you know, that becomes your norm. So being able to adapt to any sort of situation, excellent skill. Yeah.
I don't know how to word this, but to me it's noticing things that you wouldn't notice as a local.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of a sudden, when they would notice things and they might say something so local and they would be like, oh yeah, we do that way.
Yeah.
And,
Absolutely. Observing things that you wouldn't typically pick up as a local, for example. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, a lot of third culture kids develop excellent observational skills. And it's like a sixth sense. It's really interesting. And I think related to that, you see a lot of creativity in third culture kids. And I believe between speaking multiple languages, being exposed to new things all the time, and developing these observational skills, also having to rely on more than just verbal language, I really think all helps to create creative third culture kids. That doesn't mean they're going to become artists, but maybe they're creative problem solvers, or maybe they are writers. There's a lot of writers. A lot of third culture kids write. So yeah, I love that one. That's one of my favorites. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I think just with all of those things you've talked about, I think maturity as well.
Yeah.
Results from those experiences.
Absolutely. There's a level of maturity that comes from living overseas. That is so true. The interesting little caveat to that is, for some third culture kids, they're very mature in certain areas, more so than their peers. And yet, at the same time, when they get into their early 20s, you see, not for everybody, but you do see sort of a delayed adolescence. I'll kind of explain a little bit more why that happens, but it's related to identity development, and I will talk about that. And if I don't really pinpoint it, you have to remind me. Yeah, excellent. Okay, so I mean, these are all wonderful things, and this is why, you know, it's wonderful to raise children in international communities, and the world sort of needs people to think more like third culture kids. So I think we talked about almost all of these. Yeah, yep, you guys covered all of them. Excellent. Okay, so those are some of the skills that they're picking up. a couple years ago, I was doing some research as I was preparing to start Sea Change. And I was reading this study that the Thunderbird School of Global Management put out, and Harvard Business Review did a review of the research. And I'm reading it, and they were saying, okay, there's this like talent crisis out there in the world, and that they surveyed international HR executives of big multinational companies, powerful multinational companies. And they said, okay, tell us about the environment. What sort of recruiting problems are you having? How are you developing your talent? And they found that there was a concern that there was sort of a profile that they were looking for, and they were saying, it's impossible to find these people. So I thought, that's interesting. What's the profile? And the profile is, they sort of broke it down into these three things: global mindset, global entrepreneurship, and global citizenship, a term that gets overused sometimes. But this is all about everything that we just listed, ability to adapt, ability to interpret situations from different perspectives, and interest in other cultures, language skills, just having had international experience, leveraging differences. So I think for a lot of third culture kids, diversity isn't a problem, it's an opportunity. And so those sorts of things. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, you can't find them. I can introduce you to thousands of them, because that is the third culture kid profile. Then the question becomes, if we know that that's sort of what tomorrow's economy is requiring or asking for, and we know that a lot of third culture kids can develop these skills or are developing these skills, how do we make sure that really happens? How do we guarantee that that happens? And what I found with third culture kids is, if they don't get support through these transitions into adulthood specifically, they will probably get to this place anyway eventually, but they will take the long road. And there's sort of that delay that happens. Which happened with me. I think, 7 years I was depressed. If I could just have that, I would have been so much further along in everything, my relationships, my work life, etc. So that's sort of why I wanted to come talk to you. That's pretty interesting, isn't that? And there's more and more research that comes out that says this is what we're looking for. So there are sort of universal experiences that third culture kids have, and because it's such a diverse community, I can't list all of them or we'd be here forever. But I thought I'd just sort of break it down to a couple of things. So on the positive end, just being a member of the international community from the beginning is great. I always said, people would say to me, oh, it's so cool that you grew up in Japan and Singapore. And I'd say, I always say, I didn't earn it. I was born to my parents, and my dad both my mom and dad wanted to see the world, but I certainly am appreciative. So having that membership is amazing, and it opens the doors. If you can keep those relationships going and sort of keep that interest going with your kids, they belong to a huge network all over the world, opportunities all over the world, friendships all over the world, and they can continue sort of applying those skills that they picked up as they were growing up. One of the this is not going to be surprising to you, but one of the main, let me put it this way. When I first started Sea Change, I surveyed 140 adult third culture kids, adults that grew up internationally. And for those that had a really good time transitioning, hardly any problems, I was really curious in them. Okay, what was different for you? What happened? What worked for you? How can I learn from you? And the key thing, one of the main things that they all said was family. Family helped. And I know you're parents, so that's not going to surprise you. No pressure either. But the thing is, and I've seen this with the kids that we work with, is if there's siblings in your family, if the siblings have moved around, they can really bond and connect because they are growing up internationally together. And so no matter where they go, they'll always have a shared understanding, depending on the age difference. Developing communication skills within your family, and I'll talk about this a little bit. If communication is strong within the family, that is a huge, that's like the number one thing you can do is work on your communication skills with the family to help them through transitions and through life. What does that look like? I'll tell you in a second. But that's an interesting thing. Basically, all third culture kids experience loss, and that's because we live in great places and we make great friends, and then we lose those great places and we lose those great friends, at least through distance. Thank goodness we have the internet. And loss, yes, that might sound scary and sad, but loss is also connected to love. You know, you loved a place, and so you grieve something that you love. But that is a common experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how do you help your children through losing those assets as they go throughout their lives. And then reverse culture shock, like I said, experiencing distress and confusion by interacting with your own culture, or at least your parents' culture. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about with this, which is identity development. And when you're thinking about a young person developing their identity as a third culture kid, what might be some challenges there? When they're figuring out who they are.
So they're always asking about the home country, and they try to compare the situation that we are now, this country, and
Yeah.
compare everything.
Mm-hmm.
What there, what here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So comparing this country to that country and trying to make sense of all of that, and
The coolest.
right. What is the coolest one? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to check myself every time I move because I'm always comparing the last place. Well, in New York, they had better bagels, you know, or whatever it might be, and then, you know, it's a pattern you've got to really nip in the bud. Yeah.
And along with that, sort of a value, ascribing a
Yeah.
value to certain things which can be harmful.
Yeah. Give me an example of ascribing a value to some things that could be harmful.
Especially within different schools, a certain approach
Yeah.
we find not as effective, and therefore you don't appreciate it.
Yes. I'm going to give you an example, and I think this jives with what you're saying. But for example, in Japan, the school I went to was run by, it was basically British run. It was international, but it was British run. British and Japanese nuns, which was actually delightful, but that could sound a little scary. And it was a wonderful school, but it was hard, and it was a British system, and there was no space for like fooling around, and it was just like you get your work done and you follow through, and there was no like touchy-feely kind of stuff going on. And then I came to the United States, and not only was I a couple of years ahead of my American classmates, it has nothing to do with my intelligence, it just had to do with the educational system. Kids could get away with anything, and they were cursing, and they were being rude to their teachers. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I wanted to bring a tape recorder because I thought if I tell my mom, she'll never believe this. And so then when that happens, you think, ugh, either you can have all different kinds of reactions. Unfortunately for me, when I was 13, my reaction was, all right, fine, then I'm not even going to try. And then I went from having really good grades to bad grades until I finally got back up again. Is that sort of related? Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
In raising our kids in our own culture of origin with the values where we're raised.
Yeah.
Just relate to what you were saying last week. My 15-year stepdaughter, was leaving the home, makeup all over.
Yeah.
Just shaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd never seen makeup, I don't know, until I got to college.
Right. Right. And she's 15.
Why are you putting makeup to go to school? And she's going to a Catholic school. I was like, I went to Catholic school.
Yeah.
So it's just hard, and we always have this discussion where I say to her, outside is America, but
Right,
here
inside.
in the house it's Africa.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
that, and I know it's hard for her, but
Yeah.
I don't know how best to convey that.
we're definitely going to talk about that. I mean, can anyone relate to that? Yeah. I mean, everyone's going, oh gosh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's, and you know what your daughter is doing? She's going in between worlds every day, right? Like you said, she's in Africa, she's here in the States, you know? She's going back and forth every day, navigating it. And yeah, that's really hard. And it's scary if you're a parent, because you have certain cultural values from your own background that you want to make sure that they have. On the other hand, they're developing into independent adults, so where is that line? Yeah.
Oh, the feeling of where you belong, and I think
Yeah.
that's very important for the identity.
Yeah.
I was a third child.
Okay. I was like, I bet you were a third culture kid.
I was, and now my kid is also. And I never felt where I'm from. Like,
Yeah.
I keep saying, I'm from this country, no, from that country. No,
Yeah.
I'm more loyal to this country.
Right.
And I think this affected my maturity for my identity. And
Yes.
I worry about my kid.
Yeah.
She already says she's an American Arab, not an Arab American.
Oh.
She's American before Arab.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, absolutely. And what I want to share with you about identity development is, is anyone familiar with Erik Erikson? He's, okay. So, famous psychologist that did work on identity development. And he developed a theory. I mean, things have evolved since then, but he's really important. And one of the things he talked about was that in our adolescence, we play around with different roles. So for example, it's like putting the makeup on and going to school and seeing what kind of a reaction do I get from that, or I mean, I had like Western friends in Japan that completely took on a Japanese identity and like would only speak Japanese and would only dress like the other Japanese kids, and you know, and what are they doing there? They're trying on different roles and sort of personas, trying to figure out what works for me. What kind of attention do I get from that? Is this the kind of person I am? And but when you're a third culture kid, you're being pulled in so many different directions. My parents would say, I remember I came home one day with a Singaporean accent. I was waiting tables, and I came home with a Singaporean accent. My mom was like, "You're from New York," you know. And I don't have a Bronx accent, but I can do a good Singaporean accent every now and then. You know, it just came out naturally. But I was trying to fit in with my coworkers, and it just sort of happened. And then when I go home, I have to turn it off because my mom is terrified that I'm going to lose that New York edge or whatever it was that she's worried about. So that makes it really hard. If we don't get to experiment and then eventually pick the parts of our identity that make up who we are and integrate those parts, then according to Erik Erikson, we have a hard time having intimate relationships. And I don't just mean romantic intimate relationships, but friendships, even work relationships. Because if we don't know who we are, how can we connect with others? And so for the work I do, we do a ton on identity development, trying to figure out who are you, that sort of thing. So anyway, I'm going on and on, but that's sort of that. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, I saw your hand.
Also, you can have a child who doesn't like the local culture
Yeah.
and doesn't want to fit in because he don't belongs to that.
Yeah.
So there's kind of, so all of, for example, my last daughter, all our friends are not Americans.
Yes. Yeah. So people.
She's very American. She's in the American city public school.
Mhm.
She's good with that. She's very happy with teachers and things, but all our friends are foreigners.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So she's here in the United States going to an American school, but she will not have any American friends. All of her friends are international. So the reason
Tried hard.
she tried, it didn't work. Well, you know what? I can completely relate to that experience. And the thing is, and we'll talk about this later, but and this completely relates to identity, which is that, okay, if I'm not American, and if I'm not this, or if I'm not that, then who am I? Well, there is this third culture, and that is really the community that your child belongs to, or I would say that she would belong to. So, and that's the international community. So where did she seek friends? She wanted to find other third culture friends, because no matter where you live, like this group of people, you know, if we got time to talk to each other, we would find so much in common. We might be like a little more comfortable chatting with each other than we might be with some people that are like stayed in the same place their whole lives in your hometown, for example. And that's because we have shared experiences that are part of this international community. And so to me, it completely makes perfect sense. And the key there is, if you want a good adjustment, then you help her embrace that she's international versus American or whatever it might be. Not always easy, I know. I totally understand. Yeah.
Yeah, we've been, at home, we've been observing, like what's happening. We have 15 years old, 12 years old, and 6 years old.
Okay.
So we have all this variety of.
Yeah.
We've been observing it's different from a child to another.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a process.
It is.
But the three of them, they started asking us questions about, not the 15, but the 12 and the 6 years old, about how they've been living in our original country.
Yeah.
And all these memories, they want to pick up the memories.
Yeah.
What type of food that they like
Yeah.
and what they didn't like.
Yeah.
And we found out also that part of the observation that they, especially the middle school girl, that she started saying, no, is it a bad where we are coming from?
Oh,
comparing.
yeah.
And that was bad, and that was right.
Yeah.
Picking all these experiences, but keeping it positive in the house is like part of
Oh, it's so important.
help in this process.
Absolutely, and I'm going to respond to that and move on. But I think that's something that I think the international community needs to talk about a little bit more. And I think that there are other factors that sort of compound some of this confusion around who am I, and that can be related to socioeconomic status, sort of how the country that you're in right now perceives the country that you're from, sort of like the climate, the international climate, race, and those things really need to be talked about. And depending on where you are in each place you move, who you are could be a positive thing or a negative thing. So absolutely, what you can control is what happens at home, and to sort of frame those stories positively, or if you hear them telling stories that sound negative, you can reframe it so that it's positive. Is it really brief?
Just a question.
Sure.
Will you be offering later some practical
I'm about to get there.
tips
Yeah.
for helping our kids develop their identity?
Yes.
In the
Yeah.
international?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, let's go there right now. There you go. So what can you do? What are like some practical solutions? There's so much to say. So what I try to do is to sort of boil this down to sort of the main things that you can do. And then if you have more questions, you can always get a hold of me, and I'm happy to help you. There's also a list of resources outside. So if you want to read more about it, or whatever it is, if you want some interesting blogs that talk about this stuff, I've listed all of those for you that I would recommend. As far as sort of making sure that our kids are reaping the benefits of this international life, the one thing that I would suggest is naming the process. So this sort of comes from the therapeutic world, where because kids go throughout their life and they are using coping strategies, but they don't always know that those are coping strategies. And so if they're the positive coping strategies, then you want to reinforce that and name those strategies for them. So for example, a nice thing to do is to sit around at home and talk about, like, the last move or where you came from or whatever it might be. And you can make it really lighthearted. It doesn't have to be like sitting on the couch, making eye contact and revealing all of your feelings. You can still make it fun and lighthearted if you want. You can do the other one too. But you can talk about, okay, remember when we moved from Kenya to France and you did this hilarious thing where da-da-da. Let's reminisce. Tell me that story. I love that story. You tell me that story. And you listen to your child tell the story of how they moved, and what you want to listen for are coping strategies that are really positive that they can take with them. So maybe it's they were really tough, and maybe like you were upset about saying goodbye to your friend, and they were, hugging you and saying, like, it's going to be okay. You can still be in contact with them via Skype or something like that. Or they made everyone laugh when they were feeling sad to leave. Or they wrote a really lovely note to their favorite teacher before they left. Picking those things up and saying, you know what, I felt really good about moving because I've noticed that you do these sorts of things where you say goodbye nicely or whatever it might be. And that's a great thing that you do. And you should always do that. Or I love your sense of humor. It gets us through the hard times. And that's a really cool thing about you. And I hope you always keep that. So just reinforcing it, naming it for them. Authenticity, this is really a hard one, encouraging authenticity in your children. Because we're constantly moving from one culture to another, sometimes in the same day, one reaction can be for TCKs to be like chameleons. So it's like, all right, well, when I'm with my Japanese friends, I'm going to behave like this. I had a friend whose octave in her voice would change. If she was with her Japanese friends, she's half Japanese, half American. With her Japanese friends, her voice would go up, her whole body language would become more formal. And then with the Americans, she'd drop her voice and be all slouchy. Literally, I'd watch it happen in one day, you know, back and forth. So those are two very real parts of her. But sometimes that can get taken to another level where we're not comfortable being ourselves, so we sacrifice our identity and we just act like everybody else. And that can be, there's some positives to that, but that can also be a problem. So try and find ways to encourage their authenticity. And I will say that while I think it is important to keep some of your family traditions and your family stories active, no matter where you live, it's also equally important not to enforce your identity on your child. I get a lot of questions from parents who are one nationality, or two different nationalities, and they say, no, I keep telling my kid, you're Dutch. And then the other spouse is like, no, I keep saying you're German, you know. And the kid's like, I don't know, I go to American school, I feel American, you know, and oh gosh. So it's just important to sort of try not to push too hard on the identity piece. It doesn't mean you sacrifice your background at all. Family closeness, like I said, is really, it's like the key thing you can do is to make sure that you guys are close. I could talk for hours about how do you do that. It's obviously much more complicated, or there's more to it than just me telling you to be close. There's Dan Siegel is a famous American psychologist that talks a lot about parenting, and his book Parenting from the Inside Out I think is an excellent book to read. Just caveat, he's American, so there might be some cultural stuff there that is specifically American, but I still think it's an excellent book for anyone to read. And he gives you very practical examples of how to foster closeness. One of the things he talks about is just making sure you're communicating. And another one he talks about is like if there is a conflict, to try and address it right away, like to try not to sweep it under the rug. There's so much more to it, but just in the interest of time, I can't go through all of it because it's pretty complicated. But parenting from the inside out, and it's also listed in your resources. I'll talk a little bit more. So resilience, that's a term that we hear all the time, gets, I think, a little overused sometimes, but I mean, it's a great thing, right? Resilience is a great thing. Resilience is actually, people a lot of times talk about resilience as if it's a personality trait, but in the human development world, we say that it's really more a series of behaviors. It's not really, which is great because that means you can teach them. And what's really interesting about how do you help your children demonstrate resilient behavior, there is some interesting research that says that when kids have hobbies and they practice those hobbies or activities with an adult outside of their parents, they are more likely to be able to demonstrate resilient behavior when they need to. And which is sort of related, I mean, for me, that's like one of the reasons why mentoring works really nicely. But when I was interviewing all these adults that grew up internationally, they said, one person said, you know what saved me, what really helped me to have a pretty easy time transitioning into adulthood was my love for football. Not American football, but soccer. He said, because football is played the same way everywhere in the world. So I don't have to speak your language. I don't have to understand your cultural norms or even your cultural values. Once we get on the field, we're playing football. And that was a huge thing, and I thought, that's beautiful. But if your child isn't athletic, the arts are a great thing. For me, music is really what kept me together. And it gave me a language that no matter where I go in the world, if I talk to other musicians or music lovers, we can get excited and exchange ideas together. Same thing for the arts, et cetera. robotics or whatever your child might be into. But the idea is doing it with an adult, a coach, a neighbor, an aunt or an uncle, someone you trust, obviously, is a great thing to provide for your child. Now, I know that it's really hard as we move around to keep those adult relationships for our children. So like your child's auntie might be on the other side of the world, and how do you maintain that relationship? If you're in a situation where they have access to Skype, I have a friend who lives in Holland, and her sister and her sister's kids live in Philly. And they connect once a week on Sundays over Skype, and my friend tutors her nephews in math, and then they have a little family time. It's amazing. She felt so disconnected from them for a while, and now they're back together, and it's great for the little boys to have someone outside of mom and dad that they can talk to. So that's just one idea. Okay, losses and goodbyes. I have a question for you. When you are leaving a country, does anyone have a sort of a ritual that you like to do as a family, or a tradition that you have?
Yeah, we asked our kids to write everything that they remember the most, the things that they enjoyed the most.
That's
and
great.
Things that they will miss, and things that they are hoping to find in the next
Perfect.
place that we go to.
That is perfect. I'm going to repeat that because that is perfect. Okay, so sitting down with the kids before they leave and saying, write down everything that you loved about this place, what you will miss, and what you are looking forward to. The reason why that is perfect is, number one, you're making sure the conversation happens. A lot of times it doesn't. Number two, you are honoring the past, and that makes for a very healthy goodbye. And then number three, you're saying, okay, great, now let's look forward. And that's really important. That's exactly that's an excellent tradition to do. Any other games, traditions, rituals that you do before you leave or when you first get to a place? Yeah.
My kids are younger, so what I do is I ask them to help me box the items so that just they understand that we're moving.
I love that.
And describe where we are going.
Yep.
And we might have video I will show them.
That's great. So as you're packing up, you're bringing the kids into the process. That's a really good one, because a lot of times when we're growing up and everything is moving around us, we feel powerless. And so trying to bring a child where it's appropriate into a place of decision making, even if it's should we keep this or should we donate it? Even if it's something like that, bringing them into that process is really helpful. And then you can use that opportunities to talk about the move. There are some gender differences in communication. I don't know if you've noticed. And so I am going to generalize half of the world's humanity, but this is based on research. But when you look at young people communicating and really talking about their feelings, girls, this is generally speaking, not all girls are like this, but generally speaking, girls like to look you right in the eye and face across from each other, and they process a lot. So they'll verbally process, they'll talk and talk, looking in each other's eyes, talking about their feelings and telling stories. For boys, if they have something that they need to get off their chest, it's better for both people to look forward. So for example, when I did mentoring offline in real time, the best thing would be for a mentor to bring his mentee to a ball game, for example. So they're sitting there watching the sport, and then the mentor could be like, "So you seem a little down," and then the kid could be like, "Yeah, I'm," and then they could talk that way. And I know it sounds silly, but this is really you see it. So there's that. Or a car ride or an airplane ride. My dad being a man would always wait to have these personal conversations on the airplane where I'm surrounded by businessmen Dad, you're totally embarrassing me. But I think for him it was easier because we're both strapped in looking this way. So right, I see everyone laughing and shaking their heads. So you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, did someone else have a, yeah?
Another thing that we do is, especially when they were younger, we will move their room, the decoration of the room,
Yes.
exactly the same.
Yes.
And then once they arrived, and after it's been a while, I would ask if they want to take something down or change something.
Yeah.
But we found that it was very find something, a common ground.
Yeah.
Something that can
Oh,
work.
yes. Absolutely. So keeping the way the room looks from place to place and then giving them an option to change it. Absolutely. And that could be as simple as like the same blanket. But that's an excellent thing to do, and it creates consistency for them. But then I also love that you add, again, an opportunity for a young person to have a bit of control, a little bit of power to say, I don't want this anymore, or I'd like this, or something like that. That's a great example. Well, I'm going to give you one other example for those of you that have younger children, although honestly I think this would still work with a teenager depending on your communication right now. I know teenagers can be a little difficult. But I talked to a mom who had kids under 7, and they'd moved multiple times. And they had a little, like a toy chest kind of thing. And she would sit down with her boys on the ground in their room, and she would say, what are, like, pick 3 things that, like, sort of, that make you happy about this place. And then they would pick 3 things, and then as they would put it into the box, she'd say, tell me about that. Tell me the story about that, like a teddy bear. Like, tell me the story about that teddy bear. Or tell me a story. So they were communicating, but it was still sort of like a fun game. And then that box kept, more and more full. And, it would be such a nice thing for him when he's older to have like all these sort of connections to these memories in different places. Great. Okay, so those are some examples. Okay, so I know it's not easy with our jobs sometimes to know that we're moving in advance, but if you know for sure your contract is up and you're definitely moving, or whatever your story is, to start talking about that sooner than later. Kids, I really think for closure you need at least a few months to, ideally in an ideal situation, at least 3 months to sort of process it, say your goodbyes, go through all of the ups and downs, all the highs and lows of those emotions, and to be able to talk about it. So the earlier you can do that, the better. Like we were saying, after they experience a loss, you can talk about what they left behind, but don't forget to talk about who your child is in that moment. You are a funny kid. You love science, and you are always thoughtful about your friends. That's who you are. Now we're moving to this place. Is our future going to hold? What do you think? What are you most excited about? Exactly what she was saying over here. Yeah.
What about, is it a good idea or a bad idea to return to the place you moved from?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it a good idea or a bad idea to return to the place that you moved from? It's a good idea. I mean, especially if you didn't get to have a good goodbye, like if you had to leave immediately, if there was like a conflict or something like that and you had to go right away, or someone's sick at home and you have to go right away. If they didn't really have proper closure, then it's not a bad idea to go back and have them say their goodbye that way. I think going back to those places is great, but I do think you have to manage their expectations that it's the whole idea that you can never go home again. I mean, as you change, but so do the people back in that place change, and they need to be aware of that. Otherwise, that can be a hurtful experience. So yeah, but I think it's still a good thing, as long as you talk about it and manage it. Yeah.
So we're moving in a couple months, and we have 1 and 3-year-olds.
Okay.
So we were wondering when is the right time. We had thought with a 3-year-old, the 2 months might seem like a really long time.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So I was wondering for really young kids.
Yeah. 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 3 months is probably a long time for, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, yeah. I think for the older, the ones where you can really get a little bit deeper in the communication, you want to give them more of a heads up. I don't know, what do you guys think, for those of you that have moved with smaller children? Yeah.
First you talk together at home,
Yeah.
and then slowly you will have a sense, and then maybe a few weeks before you start to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a good idea. And you can, oh, sorry. So she was saying first you talk together as a family at home, and slowly but surely you sort of talk a little bit more about it, and then a couple of weeks before you can be a little more clear about it. I think introducing, so do you know where you're going to be moving? What country? India. India? Okay, so you can start introducing little things here and there that will make him become familiar with India. So like photographs of the city or the town that you'll be living near, maybe music, maybe food, just little, you don't even have to be like, we are moving to India and this is what you're going to experience, but just introducing it into your kid's life. Any other advice? Yeah.
We usually have a party, and what we tell the kids is, we moved when the first time we moved with our kids, our oldest one was 2.5, and she moved again when she was 3.5. So what we did was, we organized the party, and we told her probably about a month before we introduced things about the new place, but about a month before we moved, we told her, let's organize a party, because we're going to go away. We're going to see your friends through Skype or whatever, but let's get organized and let's tell your friends where you're going. So we used all the experience and food and items that we showed her to take home, to take to the school for show and tell. Then we had a little get together in the house where she created memories with her friends. And we make little cards with her name, pictures of her friends, and then like emails, phone numbers, so they could keep in contact. And that sort of helped for us.
Yeah, yeah. That's great, excellent. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is, you know, after you move to India, to keep talking about, like, we live here now, because I think that's confusing too for for your 3-year-old. It's like, is this a trip, you know, permanence or like long-term thinking? Obviously, it doesn't work. So you want to sort of explain. I know when I first moved to Japan, my parents, before I was like turning 6. But they kept showing me pictures of Japan, a whole book of pictures of Japan. And I just kept gravitating towards the pictures of the rice fields because they were so pretty. And I thought, oh, this is so cool. We're going to live on a farm. And I thought I'd have like horses and cows and pigs. And I was so excited. I don't know where that comes from, again, because my family's from the Bronx and Brooklyn. But then we got to Tokyo, and I thought, okay, this has been a fun vacation. When do we move to our farm? And we had already lived in Tokyo for a month. And they were like, oh, no, we live here, you know. So I think to continue to talk, don't just assume that once they're there, the reality makes sense. Yeah. Yes.
When we came here last time, my son was 3, turning 4, and he asked for 6 months when we're going home.
Yeah, see? Yeah.
He's like, when can we go back to Argentina? When are we going back? Are we finished?
Yeah.
Now?
Yeah.
But one thing we did was what you're saying, like introducing all these things, but we also read a lot of stories about the place we were going to.
Yeah, that's great.
Like lots of different stories.
Yeah.
And then if they have a birthday or something like, you know, Christmas or New Year, there's something like that around the time when you're leaving, we would say we're leaving in, you know, however many months or weeks, depending on the age.
Sure.
You remember how you waited for Christmas? Remember how you wait for your birthday? And we kind of associated it like that. And then
Yeah, that's a good idea. Connecting to something they already understand.
in time spans, even if their birthday's not, you know, at a different time of the year.
Yeah.
Say, do you remember, you know, after your brother's birthday, we waited for your birthday? Well, it's going to be that
Yeah.
kind of time. That's
Right.
when we're leaving.
Yeah,
You know,
that's a good
when
one.
they're little, they're just
Yeah,
tomorrow, and we're leaving.
it's so confusing. Yeah, absolutely.
It really took my son about 6 months. He wasn't unhappy, but it took him about 6 months to realize we were staying here.
If they are unhappy, you know, when we are unhappy, I mean, you probably noticed this, but I mean, with the younger kids, a lot of times because they don't have the emotional vocabulary to talk about what they're feeling, it might manifest itself physically. So they might say, and they may or may not, they may have gotten themselves sick because they're upset, or they might not be physically sick, but the only vocabulary they know to say, I'm hurt and I need your help is, I have a tummy ache. Or something like that. So, you know, obviously with the older kids, they can say, oh, I'm sad that we are saying goodbye or something like that. Yeah.
What really helped us when we moved around is to have the grandparents come visit.
Yeah, grandparents. So it helps to have grandparents visit if they can.
If the grandparents can't, a significant family member.
Yeah.
So that consistency, we always have someone, and truthfully, we paid for it.
Yep.
We paid to have the family members
Yeah.
come.
It's worth it. If you can do that, absolutely. Having another adult figure, like a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or something like that, that they really connect with, to come visit. I totally agree. Yeah. One last one, and then I'm going to move on.
What helped me when I moved here was to take the au pair along. So basically,
Yes.
The same person was taking care of you here as at the previous location, so there was no difference.
Yeah, so if I don't know if everyone heard that, but they brought their au pair from one place to the next, so there was consistency there. That's another thing that does not get spoken about enough, although it's just starting to get talked about, is your children's relationship to an au pair, or if you have like a maid or a babysitter or someone like that, like a domestic helper. Don't forget that they have to say goodbye to that person, and you might not have a strong relationship with that person, but your child might. And so you really need to make sure that they get that process. One of the hardest things is that a lot of times parents forget to get like the contact information of the domestic helper, or someone that was helping out around the home, and so you move, and that your child never gets to talk to that person again. And when maybe they don't think that it's important then, but later they might think, wow, she meant so much to me, you know, can we call her, can we find her? And sometimes parents don't even know their last name. I mean, I know that sounds horrible, but it's really important to understand those connections that your children are making. That's a really hard one. So, okay. Okay, so I think we've got a good idea. The last thing I'll say is take care of yourself. And I know that's hard when you're a parent because you've got everything, you know, you've got so much to do, and you're worrying about your children. But in order to be there for your child, you have to make sure that you are checking in with yourself about your feelings, about moving around or coming or going, or your identity even as it shifts. So, you know, use places like the World Bank Family Network, or there's, again, on these resources pages, there's, you know, there's an international therapist directory if you're having a really hard time. But there's, you know, there's communities online. There are people that you can talk to, and it's really important that you're doing that work yourself. And that includes making sure you say goodbye to the place that you're leaving, and making sure that you're saying a good hello, and that you're checking in with yourself in the different stages of your moves. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so does anyone have a child over 18? Okay, so small amount of you. And then we've got a bunch of parents with teenagers as well. So eventually they are going to leave the nest. I just wanted to share with you a couple of things as your child is transitioning into young adulthood. So again, like I said earlier, don't pressure your child into an identity. I think that this pressuring into an identity comes up when the child is leaving home, especially if they're going off to university and they're going to be leaving. There's going to be some distance between you. A lot of times that's a time when parents go, okay, well, don't forget that you're, you know, whatever, that you're Chinese, and then there can be a lot of pressure there, and that's right at the moment where your child is thinking about, what kind of adult am I going to become? You know, where in the world will I go, and who will be my friends? And so you want to be a little careful with that. Again, it doesn't mean you deny who you are and what your heritage is, but you just don't want to push it, force it, especially at that age. I would encourage, if your child is looking for where to go for university or for their first job, you know, one of the best parts about being a TCK is that, or third culture kid, is that you could sort of go anywhere in the world. You know, you sort of feel like, well, I mean, I know I could live anywhere. But then that's also creates a problem where it's, oh gosh, I could live anywhere. You know, how will I ever decide? So when they're deciding what they want to do for university or where they want to go, I would encourage them to pick either urban centers, if that works for their personality, or diverse places. Because they're going to want that international community. They're going to want to have those international friends that understand them. You know, like for me, I went from an international culture to a small, very monocultural town in Ohio. That did not work. There was basically no hardly any international people there in my particular school. But if I had gone to a place where there was an international community, I wouldn't have lost that culture. There would have been actually a consistent line. So think about that. Talk about money before they leave. This is just generally a good idea, you know, when you're parenting your kids as they become adults, to make sure that they are financially literate But the one thing that I think it's important for the international community to remember is that, you know, there's different financial systems. And so you want to make sure that they know whatever system they're going into, that they understand. I mean, you've all been there where it's completely confusing. In one place you can't write a check. This place your signature has to be perfect. Here you get taxed. Here you don't get taxed. It's confusing. So you know, as it's relevant to your child who's becoming an adult, help them understand the system that they're going into. And if there's any, you also want to take a look at things like, if there's any like sort of financial predators out there that, like, you know, in the States, like running up college credit cards for young people because they don't understand credit, or like debt, for example, those sorts of things. So it's start while they're home, they're safe, you can talk about it, you can make it fun before it gets stressful. That's really important. And then as they're making their decision of where they're going to go, don't forget that it's not just like the cost of the rent in that town or the tuition if they're going off to university. There's also a cost associated with the time, sort of the time difference, and even just the cost of flying back and forth or the traveling to see each other, to see each other. So don't forget about that part. Yeah, there's a lot more advice, but those are like the basics. Any questions about that? Yeah. Yeah, okay, so for example, let's say you're here in DC and your child decides to go to university in Australia. That's extreme, right? So there's a cost associated, you know, they'll be paying some tuition in Australia, they'll be paying rent in Australia, but then there's also the cost of the flight there. And so that might mean that they see you less. For example, it depends on your situation. Also, just the time differences can be challenging. So when I eventually transferred to University of Oregon as quickly as I could, and although that place also sounds really remote, but it was okay. But my family was in, I think they were in London at the time. And you know, they would say, gosh, you're avoiding us, you're never calling us. But it was because I was in classes when they were available, and when you know, I was available, they were asleep. So you have to think about those kinds of things ahead of time.
Any advice for how kids can connect at university with
Mm-hmm.
third culture kids
Yeah.
so they don't feel so alone?
How can kids connect with other third culture kids at universities so they don't feel so alone? Some universities have third culture kid groups and clubs. Some universities in their international students union have third culture groups underneath that. I would encourage them to find the organizations that are filled with international students. Now, it's not always the same, because it could be one person that grew up, I don't know, in Spain their whole entire lives, and their first move is to Germany or something, I don't know. So they're not exactly the same as third culture kids, but they do have that international connection, and you'll often find other third culture kids gravitating towards international students, so they'll be able to find people that way.
Is it called a third culture kid?
Yeah, yeah. So the younger people, like this young generation coming up, are more and more connected to that term. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't even know that existed. But so yeah, they're usually called third culture kid or TCK. There's also a group called TCKid, with TCKID, which is an online platform for TCKs around the world. And then there's also Facebook groups, TCK groups all over the world in different cities that they can connect to. So if they're in a place where maybe they can't find a lot of TCKs right there physically, online they can also connect. So those are a few. And I think I listed a few of those on the resources. Yeah.
And many universities actually have an international admissions department.
Yeah.
And they can channel you, and then they probably set up information that you can
Yes.
come earlier, so you can have a workshop on the banking system.
Yes.
And insurance and the health register.
Yes, that's so important. So many universities have a special sort of program for international students. You get there a little earlier, and like you said, I'm just repeating, they learn like the banking system, the dorms, maybe some of the customs, et cetera. The one thing I will say about that is a lot of times admissions people lump international students and third culture kids in together, and for some third culture kids that creates resentment, like I'm not that, I'm this, you know. And look, there's nothing you can do about it except you can educate your admissions people, and you can educate the adults that are trying to be supportive. So that's one of the things I tell all young people, third culture kids going off into their adulthood, is you have to, if you're going to go see a counselor, you need to educate them about what a third culture kid is. There's a book there on the resources list just for counselors called Belonging Everywhere and Nowhere, and it teaches counselors what to look out for third culture kids. If you're talking to an admissions person, you know, you have to explain, like, I know it says I'm an Indian student, but I also have to you have to understand that I've lived in 5 different countries, you know. So educating the adults around you is really important. And the more you do that, the better this entire community is going to do. So, yeah. Okay, great. I'm going to move on. Okay, quick other strategies, and then we're going to stop for questions, right? Yeah, more or less. Okay, we talked about storytelling. You know, when you're with your family, tell stories, revisit stories. Listen to the role that your child puts themselves in those stories. So, for example, you might overhear your daughter or son say something like, "Well, this always happens to me. We move and I lose all my friends." So, what is the role that your son or daughter just put themselves in? What's the victim? Yeah, and a victim meaning I have no control, and it's always negative for me. And it's almost intentional, right? So reframe it. Try and listen to them telling other stories, or help them remember times where they had a little more power. Yes, we move around a lot, but remember what about your friend from Turkey? You're still in contact with her, and you guys have such a special relationship. You can even reframe the story and say, you're the connector, you know, like you're the connector. Everywhere we go, you always connect with people, or you always stay connected. Like that's your role. We don't have to be that literal, maybe with teenagers, but you can find a little way to manipulate it into a story. But try and pay attention to the role they put themselves in, change it to a positive if it's negative, a more proactive one. If you're hearing them say things like they're the victim, then again, you might want to think about ways to give them a little more control, a little more power, and even in a very small way to help them feel less trapped. Hobbies and activities, so important. Life skills. So depending on where they're going to become adults, they might need to do things like drive a car or have a bank account or these sorts of things. And if I'm out and I'm talking to another adult and they say they don't have a driver's license, I say, "Are you a third culture kid?" Because so many of us don't, myself included, I admit. But don't do as I do. You want to really encourage your kid while they're with you in a supported community to start learning some of those skills that, for whatever reason, because of moving around, they might not have gotten a head start on compared to their peers. Educate yourself, so take a look at those resources so you sort of understand what's going on. Identify support systems, so the World Bank Family Network is a perfect example of that. If you're in a place that doesn't have that, you can always go online. There's a really active community online that's incredibly supportive. So I'd encourage you to do that. The last thing I'll say is, and I talked about educating support providers, but don't forget to really encourage what we say in the field is help-seeking behavior. So if and this is especially true for the older kids, so like over 12, let's say. If they're saying, well, you know, I don't like the way that my teacher said this to me, then instead of saying, okay, well, I'm going to go talk to that teacher right now and fix it, say, okay, well, how could we solve that problem? What do you think are some ways that we could solve that problem? And then you start early with that, and then as they get a little bit older, you can do things like if they say, I'm just feeling really down lately, okay, how can we solve that? Like, obviously, you want to listen to them. You don't want to be like just solving the problem. But after they get it off their chest, then say, okay, what can you do to make that better? You can go talk to the counselor. You can maybe start exercising. That's always good for your mental health. You know, I can do that together with you if you want, or you can do it with a friend. We can make sure we check in with each other once a week or every day or whatever you need. But help them come up with the solutions themselves, because that kind of help-seeking behavior is incredibly important when they move off to become a young adult And who knows where you might be in the world and where they might be in the world. So it's very important. And it's important for anybody, but for third culture kids, that transition into adulthood can be sticky. Okay. I just want to end on this note that, we're sort of talking about some problems and coming up with solutions, but I want to go back to the point that being a third culture kid is a true privilege, I think. I'm incredibly grateful for the international adventures that my parents worked so hard to give us. And it's still a part of who I am. It brings my sister and I joy to slip back into Japanese or to, watch an old commercial from Singapore or whatever it might be and connect. It still brings us joy. We still bring those traditions, certain foods, certain traditions at home. We still continue from all the different places that we lived. If you can work on some of these things that we talked about today, and if your child is supported, then there are all kinds of things, sorts of perks. So I talked about earlier employment. The world is their oyster. They're developing skills that tomorrow's economy requires. So that's great. They just need to learn how to advocate for themselves, how to name those skills, how to talk to employers about those skills. A lot of times we get a great education, whether it's formal or informal, just by traveling the world. I think that third culture kids, if supported, if it's all managed right, are really set up to be leaders around the world, whether it's concerning diplomatic matters, whether it's concerning solving big problems that affects multiple countries. I mean, we're all interconnected. So, when there's a financial crisis here, then how might it affect this country and how might it affect that country? If there's an earthquake here, how does it affect this industry and that industry and this education and that person? And TCKs are really able to think that way. So there's tremendous potential. It can be very fulfilling to be a third culture kid, to always sort of seek out adventures and to have friends and loved ones around the world. I think a lot of times we see different forms of poverty as we are third culture kids and see the world, or we might see different kinds of injustices around the world. And when we see it in person, it just means more. We might have like one of the girl I was telling you about that was half Japanese, half American. She grew up in Beirut, and during it was just complicated. She saw a lot of conflict, and but knowing her and seeing her come through that made me feel very empathetic, to people living in serious conflict and violent places. So. We develop our empathy there. So what can we do with that when we're older? We can serve others. We can do community service. We can solve these larger problems. And even in a small sense, like I always find myself sorting out like diversity problems at whatever my job is. So like two groups are not getting along. I always just find myself being the bridge. Like, no, that's not what that person meant. No, you're misreading their body language. You're actually saying the same thing, so we can be sort of bridges between cultures. And then again, just having that international network. So those are all the positives. There's so much more, but that's basically that. I'm going to take questions, but I'm going to just tell you really briefly about Sea Change, because it sort of wraps up everything I just talked about. Like I said, I started Sea Change a couple years ago, and we work with young people between 13 and 23, so sort of in three groups: the young 13 to 16-year-olds, the transition group 17 to 19, and then sort of the college-age kids. And we match them with other third adults that also grew up internationally, so that they understand what it's like. Then I screen them to make sure they're well-adjusted and other things as well. And basically the goal, there's two goals. One is to make sure that, or to help the TCKs name the skill sets that they're developing and then apply them to their academic goals, their career goals, and their personal goals. And then we also help them develop coping strategies to deal with any challenges that they might face. They meet online once a week, no matter where they are in the world, and they have structured conversations. I've written a whole curriculum where there's like activities and projects to do. But to give you an example, we had a student who is American but going to a British school in Holland, and she wants to become a scientist, but she literally had no idea where in the world should she go to do that, what university system should she use, et cetera. So we matched her with a marine biologist in Mexico who grew up in the UK and other countries in the British system, and they were able to connect that way. But while they were connecting on that, the mentor is trained to also talk about identity and saying a good goodbye and talking to your parents about saying goodbye and these sorts of things. So that's sort of just an example of how it would actually look. So that is that. Any questions? Yes. Oh. Oh, microphone.
I can speak up now. My question is not a very important.
No, we are taping.
Yeah, we're taking a video.
Can you? I don't think that is it?
I think it is, yeah.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
You say you start working with 13 years
Yeah.
old. But why do you start working? I have a 10-year-old who's about to be 11 years old.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have moved here like 2.5 years ago. And I feel like he has been struggling the moment we have arrived here.
Yeah.
So why is the target starting with 13 years old?
Excellent question. I'll tell you. I've got a very good answer for that. When I first started Sea Change, I thought, okay, 16 to 23, because in the psychology world, that's called emerging adulthood. And that is actually the time when TCKs are the most vulnerable. It's a very critical time. If they're experiencing reverse culture shock at 18, which is generally when a TCK leaves home, if they're experiencing culture shock and not getting support, their feelings of grief could turn into depression. If they don't get help within that first year, then they're more likely to go into another really bad place where they're more prone to suicide and things like that. So for me, it was a very specific group that's more vulnerable than any other time in a TCK's life. That said, then I'm just an entrepreneur. I'm doing this on my own. So as I started talking to parents around the world, I get this question, hold on a second, I've got a 13-year-old, and they could. So I thought about what is my background, what can I do that I know well, that I really am an expert on, and it really ends at 13. I mean, someone else should, and I totally would encourage them to do a program for 0 to 11. It's a different set of things that happen with an 11-year-old, as it is with it's a different set for 13-year-olds than it is for an 18-year-old. But yeah, someday as I get bigger, I'd love to do the entire lifespan. I gotta start small.
Excuse me, Carol.
Sorry.
The microphone is there.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so as I said, our kids are pretty young, and so while we've moved around, they're still really young to start experiencing some of these issues. But
yeah.
I wanted to ask if you have any tips or can point to any of the resources you've listed for things that can help our families back home. Because we come from a background where we're the only ones in both our families who have actually lived outside not the country, the city. Like everybody else is living the very similar kind of life to what our parents, our grandparents live. And so they have a hard time understanding us, but we can live with that. But we would like to help our kids not have such a hard time relating to their own grandparents, uncles, aunts, and so on, because they're just going to be very different from everybody else in the family.
Excellent question. The first thing I can say is keep that language. Like whatever grandma speaks, make sure that your children learn how to speak that language. Make sure that they have a common language. That's really important. And you see that a lot with third culture kids that leave at a young age and maybe they lose their mother tongue or they're not quite as fluent in that language. They come back to see grandparents and the grandma says, I love you, and the kid is like, I don't mean what you're saying. And that's completely heartbreaking for everybody. So you want to really try and maintain language. If there's a primary language that you use with your child, it's also really important to maintain that. No matter where you move, it's great to add languages, but make sure that that stays consistent, because that's when we learn our emotional. Like if English is my first language and it's the language that my parents, when I cut myself and started crying and my mom would say, it's okay, come here, we'll put a Band-Aid on it. that's an emotional thing that happened between the two of us. And so I want to be able to have that as I get older, because, you know, when you're stressed or angry or sad, don't you go back to your first language, right? So it's the same thing for young people. So that's one thing. The other thing I would do, two other pieces of advice. The other thing I would do is, and I don't know if it's possible. I mean, I know from my family too, it was not possible, so I'm not sure. But if there's a way to for your child to communicate with them on a regular basis. You know, when I was growing up, we didn't have the internet. We certainly did not have Skype. But I was a pen pal with my grandma, an aunt, and a cousin, 2 cousins. And even when I was 3 years old, I mean, I was a little bit older, but I could barely write. I wasn't exactly a communicator. I would just tell my mom, tell Nana that I miss her, and today we had sushi, you know, or something like that. So there's just like these little tiny things that your family can learn, but it's not overwhelming, and there's a open line of communication. And the third thing I'd say is when you go back to visit them, don't overwhelm them with stories. So my mom would bring home cases of slides and make everyone sit down, and this is the time we went to Kenya, and this is the time we went to Beijing, and everyone's like bored out of their mind and resentful, and and just like, oh, she's such a show off, and but it was a great adventure for her, and she wanted to share it, but you have to be aware of the receiver. So it doesn't mean you hide your stories, but you sort of you carefully edit and you share little by little, because it's overwhelming for your family to kind of hear it all. So those are 3 pieces of advice. Yeah, microphone. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to go by there.
Okay.
Yes.
So thinking about our children as they grow into young adulthood, and going back to what you said, I thought it was really interesting that you had friends around the world who were all feeling really depressed.
Yeah.
And that there had to, struggling.
Yeah, struggling.
And that there had to be a common reason or some commonality. Yeah. What is that? Is it? I have a guess.
What's your guess?
Sort of, it's identity related.
It is, yeah.
That because I've done a lot of reading about in developmental economics about identity as a human need.
Yes.
And so when you're shifting identities and you don't have it solidified.
Yeah.
Is that really?
I do think that's a huge part of it. And I think also you lose your community. And okay, so when you are little, so like 10, let's say 10, maybe 12 and younger, you mirror your parents. You figure out your normal by looking at your mom and dad. So, if you have a little one, maybe there's like a loud sound, your baby will look at you to go, wait, how should I respond? And then if you get nervous, then your baby's going to start to cry because your baby is nervous. Or if you're like, oh, that's hilarious, it was a firecracker or something like that, then the little kid might giggle. So they're looking at you, they're mirroring, they're going, okay, I'm going to copy this. This is, my parents are normal, I'm going to copy this. When we go into adolescence, then we shift and we start mirroring our peers, right? That's when it gets really complicated and adorable. So, you shift your mirroring from your parents to your peers. What's really important as we develop is for our peers to validate our identities and our experiences. So you see this with any group that is like a subgroup or like a minority group or just a group that's not part of the majority. If their experience isn't being mirrored by their peers, it's going to cause some distress. So you see this, for example, in a community that does not accept gay people, and you've got a gay child that's turning 13, 14, and they're looking around and they don't see anyone like them, they're going to be distressed, which could lead to depression, which could lead to drugs and alcohol and even suicides. So it's the same kind of thing. That's part of it. So when you leave your international community and you go, this is what all my friends were going through. They went from an international community back to their hometown in Brazil. And then they go back there and they look around and their peers no longer look like them, act like them, understand them, have the same shared experiences and cultural references. And so that causes distress, and then that can cause depression, and then that can lead to other things. So that's why I say find an international community. Don't lose that line.
So for adolescents, it's really important to find other third culture kids for them to be around.
And your early 20s. I mean, and the rest of your life. But especially in that age period, because of where we are developing. Yeah. There's a question back there too.
My daughter, my son he's lived in Australia where we're from originally, but we moved to Cambodia and then to the States. But my daughter, this is her only place that she's lived.
Yeah.
So she's sort of, from just before birth from just after birth to now. But she seems to miss out on the memories of when my son was small in Australia, when he was small in Cambodia, and she seems to be searching for memories for herself. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
That's a really tough one, and I hear versions of that question a lot. I actually struggle with the answer to that one. I think that, you can, I would go to the naming the process with her, so as fun things happen here, and as she has a sleepover party with her friends and has the best time ever, or whatever it might be, to name that for her, and I know it sounds almost calculated, but to really say, that was a great memory, you're so fortunate, and that's so unique, something that's just about her, but to repeat to her that she is creating memories, they're just memories in the United States, and to give that equal play compared to the reminiscing together as a family. It'll leave, because that leaves her out a little bit. That's a tough one. And it's the same kind of thing for when like my sister is 6 years older than me. So actually she never lived in Singapore. And she was in the States working her tail off and, and having a very different experience while I was in Singapore enjoying my international life and developing these memories. And I'm sure it wasn't easy for her. So I think trying to find ways to create a little more balance, it's not easy. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. I would like to add a comment on what they said. My parents, my father worked for 30 years for the UN, so that means we lived in so many countries with different languages.
Yeah.
And we lived in a completely different countries, coming from Africa and ending up in Asian country.
Yeah.
So the language, the color of the skin, make it very exotic and very difficult for us to be established as the only African family in international school.
Yeah.
But our parents managed to speak our own African language. So what was the link with our family? And the thing is, once we come back home for holidays, is to be connected with the family, not to go with the international kids or the TC children.
I hear you.
Because then we get lost. And when we get lost, because we don't feel African, we don't feel European, we don't feel American, we don't feel anything. So the problem, you get lost, and the best way to build up your self-esteem is to remain and stay what you are.
Yeah.
So what our mother used to tell us is go and play outside with the neighbor to know how they think. Go and stay with them instead of going with international kids, because they will be living and you'll be staying here. And at the end, of course, I'm an international kid, but I'm African at the end.
Yeah.
So I think you have to maintain the link.
Yeah.
Not always going and searching for international kids, because this is not going to help at the end.
I think what you're saying is really interesting, and I do think that there has to be a balance. And like I said in the very beginning, I said I'm Irish American, and like in the States that wouldn't be considered an ethnicity, but for me it's a very similar, there are family traditions, there are songs that when my immigrant grandparents came over, they brought it from Ireland to New York. And I grew up sitting around with my grandma and my uncles and aunts and cousins singing those songs, and then talking about how did our family come over, what were their struggles, who does that make us? And we were always talking about we are fill in the blank because we are Irish American, And for me, that has been a huge source of strength and consistency in my life. And I think it relates to what you're talking about, like coming home, speaking your family's language, connecting and not always going outside. And I think that's good to have in your life. I think sometimes you see third culture kids as they get into their 20s, will over-identify as a third culture kid and will say, I am not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm this. And I know this is a little confusing, but I look out for that. In a lot of different theories talking about how do we develop certain identities, maybe it's our religious identity or our sexual orientation or our racial identity in the United States, there's this one similarity that I've noticed, and I think it's related to third culture kids too, which is that there's this period where we might hide our identity. So we might, in the very beginning, at the very beginning, we might not even understand our identity. We're not even thinking about it, and then we might understand. Then we might understand that we're different, and then we might hide that difference because we want to be like everybody else. And then we learn a little bit more, and then maybe we decide to embrace that difference. But when we embrace it, we over-embrace it. And we sort of leave these other parts of our identity that are very important behind, and we only focus on this. So I know a lot of 20-year-olds that say, I only have friends that are third culture kids. I think they're missing out, you know? But they can still say, I'm a third culture kid. This helps me understand these things about me, but I'm also African, or I'm also whatever it is. And I think that's important, so that balance. But the other thing that you're talking about there is that you had a family that paid attention to staying close. That's so important, yeah. And the language thing I think is really important. You've got to keep that language. The other thing that you talked about is like sort of like feeling exotic in Asia and like that kind of attention. I understand in my own way. People used to pet me. Yeah, so yeah. But that's a really important thing that we need to talk about more, and especially for kids as they're growing up. If you're a big research nerd like I am, you can look at Danao Tanu, and I think she might be in the resources, but she's Asian, and she's writing a lot about race, class, and the concept of Americanism in international schools around the world, whether they're American or not. And it's really interesting. There's also, if you've got kids that are teenage age and they're looking at universities at this point, there's a woman named Amanda Bate, and she is from Cameroon, but it's complicated because she's a third culture kid. She is just especially sensitive to the experience of racism in different international communities. So that's another person you can go to if you're thinking about preparing your teenager for adulthood. She gets it. I'm always looking for people that get it, so yeah.
I would like to add something for people, especially with very young kids and moving soon, just to keep in mind that we have at WBFN some books, and they are all that we bought for your consultation. And we have been in touch years ago with I cannot remember her name. She did her PhD at Penn State or Pennsylvania, on how to use literature with kids and depending on the age. So especially young kids, to name the process, put names on the emotions, and they cannot do that at 2, 3, 4 years old. So through a story of a little horse or a little boy moving and the fears of the kid or of the character, you will, reading the story to your kids, you can really open a kind of dialogue appropriate to the age. So we have a few books at the office upstairs, and we also have in our files a huge list of books that Amazon everywhere in the world can bring them to you.
Yeah,
okay,
excellent.
So keep that in mind. It's fabulous. There's
some great stuff for the little kids. And I think there's a book, I don't know if we're talking about the same person, but there is, it should be on your resources list, I'm almost positive it is, but it's on sort of creatively helping kids through international transitions in the classroom, but I would suggest it as a parent to look at it, and it's the same kind of thing, looking at literature, et cetera. It's great. There's also Slurping Soup, which is like for little kids, a storybook. The book my parents got me was called Mitchell's Moving, and you can still get it in the States. It's about two best friends, and like one dinosaur moves 6 weeks away, and the dinosaur left home is furious. But it's written for, I'd say, under 8-year-olds, and I actually still remember it because it was very helpful for me when I was little. So,
I kind of educate my son between the cultures, and I wanted your view on it. He's now 6, and since we live in America the past 2-3 years, I've sent him home on his own to Austria for 2 to 3 months, and my parents sent him to the local kindergarten.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I kind of, am I doing anything wrong? Is there something I need to consider? Is there an age I should stop doing that?
I don't think you're doing anything wrong. I think that, you know, giving your child an opportunity to go back to the home country is great. I think that you just want to talk about it, you know, and I think I just was talking to parents who their daughter is now a young adult, but she's Japanese, her parents are Japanese, or her mom's Japanese, her dad's American. She was raised in the United States, but every summer they would send her back to Japan and she would go to the local schools there. And she had a hard time because she was bullied by the Japanese for not being Japanese enough, and then in the States bullied for not being American enough, which is common. I think that the key is talking, don't just, if they're like, yeah, it's fine, get a little deeper, trying to understand what's going on there, maybe making sure that the teachers at the school understand his scenario and sort of what that means to be a 6-year-old that has two countries, and talking it through. I think there's some challenges there, and there's a lot of positives there too. So it's really more about how you communicate about it, educate the people around you and around your son, and yeah, that sort of thing, if that makes sense. Yeah, there's a question over here.
It's not a question, it's more an advice. I just want to jump on something you said. Yeah. It's when you move and you go to a new school, go to the teacher and say how specific is your child, even if it's in an international school, to make sure that he got the point that your child might adjust first, and then that is specific. So the teacher or the principal or whatever who take care of your child will have an eye on him, on her, and keep in contact with them to make sure that the transition is fine and your son or daughter is happy and all these things. I think it's very important and useful.
One thing that, yeah, thank you. There's one thing that you're seeing a little bit more and more of. You're seeing international school admissions people at international schools around the world, and you're seeing some university admissions people doing this, where they make a point to ask how many countries have you lived in the intake form or the admissions packet. That's really important. If the school isn't asking those questions, ask them to ask those questions, or tell them. Because it's very easy, you could look at me and just say, oh, she's an American kid, she's from New York. You have no idea what my story is. And when I was depressed in my early 20s and I went to go see a therapist, I never told her that I lived overseas. I'm telling you, I don't think she knew. I never brought it up because I was just so used to hiding it to get along that I never told her. So this book that I was telling you about that educates counselors in how to support third culture kids, she says, put it on your intake form. How many times have you moved? What countries have you lived in? And what age were you at that time? Yeah.
I was just wondering, would you be having a session like this with our kids?
Yeah, so I do parent education, child education, and professional development for people that work with kids.
Would you be doing one through the World Bank?
Oh, not that I know of.
Oh, okay. It will be a great idea, I think. And I think everyone will agree with me in that.
Here's the thing, though. I will just say this. I love speaking to people. I love talking to parents. And I always learn a lot from parents, too. I mean, all of you have been doing this. You're the experts. So I get great ideas from all of you. I think that education is the first step, but there are more powerful steps past that. And the first is really looking inward into your family unit and really trying to work on strengthening your family and closeness and communications. And everyone can always improve. So, and we know how it's quite difficult. But the other thing is the reason why when I started Sea Change, I knew that there was a problem, and I knew that there was a beautiful community that had a lot to offer the world in third culture kids. And I did a lot of thinking and reviewing the research as to what would be the most powerful, long-lasting, life-lasting solution, and that's why I came up with mentoring, because just like parenting, for example, so much of children's transformation comes through our relationships. And so I love to talk to people, but I always think it's like the first step. And you could do mentoring with me, or you could do something else, but more of a long-term solution makes more sense, I think. So.
No, the reason why I brought that up was because I was thinking, as a group, most of our kids probably don't talk about this very much.
Yeah.
So if they have an expert other than mommy and daddy,
right,
that says, well, we're not expert, but we know our kids,
yes.
so we think,
right.
But if we have someone sometimes, but if we have someone, a professional like you, that brings some of these things up in a very friendly environment,
yes, right.
I'm assuming that it will be of great something very positive for all of us.
Yeah.
And they could continue with the mentoring, as you mentioned.
Yeah, they do say that there has been some studies that say that when kids are introduced to the term while they're still kids, they have a better adjustment into adulthood. So yeah.
Could I just?
Sure.
Okay.
Sorry.
On the same topic, I mean, this specific. Yeah.
I'd just like to add to what Ellen said, and what you have requested is that we do have the youth program that we are starting for bank kids, middle school age right now, but depending on what the response is, we may expand it to other ages too. And if you were interested, you can definitely pick up a flyer here. We have our coordinator for the youth programs. So again, this is what they are planning. That's the idea, is for them to get together and share a platform where they can express, connect with each other, and provide them with strategies to do exactly what Ellen's been suggesting. And about getting Ellen to talk to them, we'll talk about that.
And thank you for helping us to convince her to generously, because you have to understand that Ellen is giving us her time absolutely pro bono. So, but thank you for giving me more argument. Maybe we'll convince her next time she's in town. Yeah. So, the program is how the being different is rich, because together we are not different anymore.
Yeah.
So that's exactly the concept. And you have Anna behind you who is coordinating all this seminar, and please share with her your questions.
This is a question about the schools, because the World Bank no longer pays for private schools for children. And I notice that that's a problem not just for the children but for the parents. So in Washington, there are an awful lot of international schools, so teachers and other students are familiar with international students, but not completely. And there is, like you're saying, bullying and some certain types of conflict at schools for children. And then we have personally experienced kind of bad feelings among the parents in our state school, because they look down their noses at us and say, "Oh, you're not even paying taxes, and yet you're using our resources." And there's a lot of resentment from a lot of parents at our school, and I've spoken to other friends, and it's the same thing for them.
Yeah.
Would you recommend that, is it a good investment for us to pay our own money to send our child to a private school where there are more international children?
I can't answer that, only because it's such a personal decision, and it really depends on the child, the experience you're having. Each public school has its own culture, so I can't answer that. But what I can say is that that's more and more common. That more and more people, no matter who they work for, if they're living internationally with families, more and more of them are going to the local schools, and that's interesting. It's becoming more and more common. So that's sort of a new frontier, and there's a couple of things I would say about that. The first is you should read the book Third Culture Kids, and depending on how old your kids are, try and either translate some of that to them or even have them read the book, because they do talk about how to communicate with others that don't share your international background in a way that doesn't put them off. We train, like in our mentoring program, this is a big thing that we talk about, is how do you tell your story, like kind of what you were saying with like your family, and how do you talk about these experiences without alienating people or whatever it might be, but also how do you remain true to yourself and not hide all of those stories? So, but that might be a first good place to look. If you've got older teenagers, Tina Quick wrote a book called, it's in your resources, but it's called A Global Nomad's Guide to University Transition. Even if they're not going off to university, it's still a good book to read. She also talks about how to tell your story in a community that might not be so welcoming to international people. The other thing I would say is I work with a small group of parents in Holland, near Amsterdam, and it's kind of interesting. It's all American women married to Dutch men. But anyway, they have found each other, and it's a small group of about 12 families, and they all have kids around the same age, and they all go to the local schools, and they all speak Dutch, everywhere they go, basically, more or less, Dutch and English. And the kids were having a hard time finding a sense of belonging in the local schools, and there was a little bullying and that kind of thing. What they did was they created a really tight community, and they hung out like every other weekend. They would do at least one activity where everyone was welcome. And what happened was those kids were able to connect with each other because their normal was being mirrored by their peers, where it was not at school. And that's made a huge difference for them. And now they're so tight-knit. If you hear the kids talk about that community, all of those adults in their lives are their aunts and uncles, basically, and all the kids are like their cousins. It's a really lovely thing. So that's one thing you can do. It's not easy, and I think we're all getting used to that and trying to figure out how do we navigate that. But yeah, finding a community like this is helpful, even for your kids.
That's what we're doing at school, hanging out with people like this.
Yeah.
Because, the others just
It's hard. Yeah. I'm sorry. That stinks.
No, I mean,
yeah.
I'm fine with it, but,
yeah. I know.
But I think it's an interesting point that is becoming more apparent in DC as
Sure.
more children are feeding through the system.
Yeah.
Without parents who have
Yep.
the school fees.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it looks like we're at time. I just wanted to say, first of all, I do hope you take advantage of the youth network here. That is such a great resource, and not everyone gets to have those sorts of resources. So I hope you do take advantage of that, and that you take advantage of this community. I mean, as you saw, there's so many people here that have interesting ideas or insights or just memories to share. And I often find these are great moments for us to learn from each other. So I hope that you continue to do that. And then if you are interested in anything I've said here today and you want a little more information, my contact information is up here. If you're interested in signing your child up for a mentor, the relationships last 12 months and then you re-up every year, depending on the situation. But if you're interested, you can reach out to me. We have new slots right now. So, but if that's not your thing, but you still want some help somewhere else, maybe I can connect you with somebody. I've tried to do a really good job sort of curating the resources that are out there, because there's so much out there. It's hard to know what's good and what isn't. So feel free to reach out to me too. And use the library. I mean, that's a great resource too. So thank you so much.